Hi all, and welcome back to Replay, the show where games are art. Continuing with Final Fantasy VI, we just escaped the Empire, and are now on our way to return to Terra, and see if the Espers we just picked up can help her. What's about to come up here is, of course, Terra's origin story, as it turns out that one of the Espers we picked up, who is written as Baduin in this translation, but in FF9 and some of the other games shows up as Madine, or Madine, so I'm not 100% sure, but I'm used to calling him Maduin, so that's what I'm going to go with. Right, and Terra immediately recognizes him as her father. Now, this is something that all the Super Nintendo Final Fantasies do. In Final Fantasy IV, the main character Cecil turns out to be the product of a Lunarian father and a Earth human mother. Final Fantasy V, Bart's, his father is from Galef's world, while his mother is from what we think of as our world. They're slightly different simply because ultimately the two worlds share a common origin, and the humans are both, but still, the way it's presented in the game is that his heritage is half, well, alien. And for Terra, as we'll see, she has an Esper father, Maduin, and a human mother, Madonna. So, it's interesting because, like I was talking about last time, the Final Fantasy series has a lot of presenting women as other, as magical, as otherworldly, and yet we find with the main characters of all the Super Nintendo ones, it's their father that comes from another world, and their mother that is from this world. So, to a degree, that cuts against what we were talking about last time, but at the same time, it still presents the women of this world, so to speak, as being able to connect with the other world, placing them in a position between the two worlds, and placing the characters in a position between the two worlds, a position of liminality. Can't actually recall if I've talked about liminality in prior episodes, so very briefly, liminal spaces are places that exist between other places. Roads are liminal spaces, forests are liminal spaces, doorsteps are liminal spaces. It actually comes from the Latin word for a doorstep. And the idea is that because they're between two places, they act as bridges between worlds. Liminal spaces are where you encounter people from the fairy world. They're where you encounter magic. They're where you accidentally fall out of this world and into another. And liminality is the state of existing between two worlds. So we see that with Cecil, Bart's, and especially Terra, as people who exist between worlds. Now, as I was kind of hinting, liminality tends to be very strongly associated with magic, because magic is a transformative force. So, in the space between two worlds is where transformation happens, because there's the world before the transformation and the world after the transformation. So, magic is very strongly associated with liminality, so it should come as no surprise that Terra is the most magical of those three main characters. Bart's could be anything you want him to be. Cecil is initially very fighter-focused, later gets a little bit of white magic, but Terra from the start of this game has been presented as a magic user. She is also a very good physical fighter, but her primary thing is magic. Now, I've been talking over it, but we've been getting here kind of a love story between the two worlds. And, of course, name of Madonna. Now, in this translation, I believe it's changed to Madeline, which is interestingly different. We're do I have that backwards? I'm not certain. Regardless, both names are interesting choices because both call to one or the other of the Mary figures in the Gospels. There's Mary, Madonna, the mother of Jesus, or there's Mary Magdalene, who in older traditions, and especially in the Gnostic tradition, is presented as being a feminine counterpart to Jesus, or a lover, or a wife. Her role is heavily downplayed in the canonical Gospels, but there's a lot of stuff from the time period that depicts her as being a much more important figure, and as being, like I was saying, a feminine, almost equivalent, or a straight-up equivalent. In both cases, we've got sort of a primordial feminine principle here. You've got either the mother or the primordial feminine in general. So Terra, in many ways, is a product not just of a human woman, but of, in a sense, the human woman. That her mother is a representative of all humanity. And Terra is thus a complete fusion of these two worlds. Now, which one did this translation? Okay, so this translation called her Madonna, right? This is also the translation, interestingly enough, that changed Terra's name from Tina, which of course is short for Christina, a reference to Jesus, to Terra, which isn't. So it seems like in the Woolsey translation, they just transferred the Jesus reference from Terra herself to her mother, but deliberately kept it intact, which tells us something. It tells us that that reference is very much intentional, and that reference is important enough to need preserving. Terra is very much being presented, in other words, as a messianic figure, as someone who is a savior, someone who is going to transform the world. Which is interesting because not too far from here in the game, Terra's going to kind of drop out of the story mostly. She'll still have her thing, but the main character focus, insofar as the game has one, is going to very much shift to Celeste. But then we can make an argument that Terra and Celeste, Earth and Heaven, are manifestations of a single character. Which is not to say that they're the same person at all. They have very different things going on to each other. But they're both this idea of the person who's used by the Empire, who turns against it, and who wields the merely unique power of magic. Basically, as the scope of the game shifts from the political to the apocalyptic, from revolution to saving the world, we shift from the mundane to the cosmic. We shift from Terra to Celeste, Earth to Heaven. But they're both just messianic figures. Celeste just kind of inherits that mantle from Terra. Because Terra's been represented already as the savior by the Returners. That's the role she's been offered. It's a role she's uncomfortable with. It's a role she ultimately kind of rejects. Anyway, as we're seeing in the story, the Empire somehow found their way into the Esper world and attacked and started kidnapping Espers, which is how all these Espers ended up in the Magitech factory that we just left. It also, as we'll see, is how Terra ended up in Imperial hands. Now, it's interesting to me, there's a character of Lone Wolf the Thief, which I believe we've seen in jail so far. He looks rather a lot like this Esper, and there's a few other Espers at this time type, these wolf-headed ones. It really makes you wonder if Lone Wolf might actually be a relatively human-looking Esper who escaped into or remained in the human world, or alternatively, who entered it when the Espers were kidnapped, or escaped with Ramu and the others, but then set off on his own. There's a lot of possibilities. It's kind of an intriguing little side thing that's never really addressed in the game. It's one of those dangling things, kind of like Siegfried and Siegfried, or the identity of Goga. But essentially, the Esper world is here presented as a fairy realm, an other world. It exists parallel to our world. It can be entered from our world, but it is not really part of our world. It is a place of magic and power. And as is so often the case, in folklore, Madonna entered it and remained there and fell in love and produced a child. But tragedy seems to inevitably ensue in those kinds of stories. In this case, it's Madonna's death and Terra's capture, as well as Madeline's capture, occurring at this time. But all this can be laid at the feet of the Empire, who, as we've kind of been discussing before, as a force of order to the extreme, are fundamentally enemies of magic, even as they're using magic as their primary weapons. The thing about the fairy world is it's a chaotic place. The fairies are traditionally beings. They're unpredictable, they're capricious, they're creatures of chaos. Because magic is chaotic, it's transformative, it makes things other than they are. Which kind of leads into another discussion, because I was talking last time about the presentation of women as other and the othering of magic, and the two come together here with the grotesque, the distortion of the human form, which again I talked a little bit about last time. But Terra is initially presented as, after she gains her Esper form, she's presented as somewhat monstrous and out of control. Here we see her beginning to bring it under control. She understands who she is now, and she's able to bring her Esper form both under control, and it ceases to be presented as grotesque. It becomes presented purely as a form of power, a unique power to which only Terra has access. Now, discussion here, as the group deals with understanding what exactly happened. And Terra raises the suggestion of returning to Narsh and seeing what's happening there, which is the next step in the game. As we'll see once we get into combat, which will happen for a little while, but as we'll see, Terra has gained the ability to, at times, and as she uses it more, it becomes more controllable and lasts for longer, but at times she'll have the ability to transform into her Esper form, which vastly increases the power of her magic. What's interesting is what that does to Terra, because now she's someone with a deep connection to another world, a young woman with a deep connection to another world, who can spin in a circle and physically transform and use powerful magic as a consequence. Terra is basically a magical girl, which, makes the timing of this right around the height of Sailor Moon's original popularity quite interesting. Because what you have with the magical girl very often is a constrained form of what you have with the what you have with the magical girl is kind of a constrained form of power. It's an expression of feminine power, but it's also an expression of anxiety about feminine power because it has to be constrained. The magical girl The transformation is often presented as a form of maturing, like an accelerated maturation process, sometimes quite literally, but it's at the same time constrained. It's something that she only does temporarily and then comes back as the cute little innocent small person. It's a little different with Terra because Terra is an adult already. She's a soldier. She already has power in her human form. But in this case, the anxiety of power isn't necessarily feminine, although, as I've talked about before, magic is often gendered in the Final Fantasy series, and RPGs in general, as being more feminine. But in the case of Terra, it's also the power of chaos and of change, which is about which anxiety is being expressed, and which is being contained. Because thus far in the game, it's being presented almost entirely positively, as something which will allow the returners to fight back against the Empire, as something which will level the playing field, as something which will break the excessive order of the Empire. Yes, the Empire is using it to conquer the world, but they're abusing it. Its proper use will defeat the Empire and restore the world to the way it should be, transform things back. Now the game starts moving into a phase where it's a little more nervous about that. And we see that here. Terra has always been uneasy with her power, but now she's starting to become more uneasy, and that uneasiness is starting to be shared. At the same time, the recognition of her liminality is being used as a way to help with the transformation of the world. That her existence between the human and Esper world means she can be used as a bridge between them, as a way of communicating between them. So we kind of have our next goal, which is to seek out and try to communicate with the Espers to the east of the Empire. That said, there's another task I want to accomplish first. Alright, so what I'm doing is heading into the Narsh treasure house, storehouse, whatever you want to call it, and surprising Lone Wolf, who I mentioned before. In fact, I now realize that we did not meet him in the jail earlier. That happens later in the game. This is actually our first encounter with him. And he's stolen most of the stuff. Well, some of the stuff in there. Specifically, he's stolen a gold hairpin, which is a good item. It has MP costs. So let's go after it and get it. So he's going to lead us deep into the mines of Narsh. Oh hey, someone else was watching us from the mines as well. We're not going to get him until much later in the game. And here we finally back Lone Wolf into a corner. But he's got a brutal hostage, namely Mog. Fortunately, being awesome, Mog is able to break loose. Unfortunately, being the fluffy comic relief character, they both end up dangling off a cliff and we have to choose. Either let Mog fall, or fail to get the gold hairpin. Now, Mog is awesome, so I went with him. And here we finally get the actual introduction to Mog. Interesting that we don't get it early in the game, but this is the point where she actually joins the party, so okay. Mog is a really interesting character. For starters, he's a Moogle. To my knowledge, the only playable Moogle in the series, at least as far as FF10, which is the last one I played. And like any Moogle, his job is to be cute and fluffy and have weird powers. In the case of Mog, he is sort of a Geomancer, which was a class in past Final Fantasy games, which had powers based on the environment. So Geomancer would use one of 4 random abilities based on where your character was. If you were in a forest, it might summon a storm of leaves or a group of rabid squirrels or something to attack enemies with. The main advantages of a Geomancer in past games were that it used magic for free. The 4 random, when you use the Geomancer ability, the 4 randomly selected abilities did not have any costs, which could be very handy as a way to, as a secondary ability for a character in a magic using class, as a way to level them up without blasting through huge amounts of MP. Mog works a little bit differently, though. How it works with Mog's dance command, which bears very little resemblance to the dances used by dancers in other Final Fantasy games, is you fight in one of, I think it's 8 environments, and he learns a dance. That dance then becomes a permanent part of his repertoire. Then when you give him the dance command, you can choose one of those dances, which changes the environment, and then uses the Geomancer abilities appropriate to that environment. However, you can't control Mog. Once you order him to dance, he keeps doing that dance forever and unleashing its abilities. However, particularly in the World of Balance, they're very useful abilities. Now comes a strange design choice. There are 2 dances, Water Rondo and Snowman Jazz, which can only be learned in one of the 2 worlds. The World of Balance is the only way to learn Water Rondo, and the World of Ruin is the only way to learn Snowman Jazz, as far as I know. So that means we have to learn Water Rondo right now. The problem is, learning it is going to require us to basically walk around the entire world. Let me fade out and fade back in, and I'll explain what exactly I mean. So, here's the issue. The only places to learn Water Rondo are to fight on the Leaf River or in the Serpent Trench. Both of those have the problem of carrying you away from your starting point, which means we end up somewhere far away from the airship, and neither of those paths is reversible. They only go one way, so we end up locked away from the airship and have to walk around huge amounts of world to get back to it. Hence, side quests. I'm just checking to see if the old man will give us any different responses. He can be a little interesting, but apparently not. So, let's... Oh, the waterfall, I believe, is also possibly a place where you can learn Water Rondo. But regardless, you've still got to go on this huge loop because you end up locked away from your starting point. So while we're doing this, I think now is a good time to talk about one of the major elements of the Final Fantasy series and of JRPGs in general, TDR. JRPGs tend to involve a lot of tedious bullshit. Oh, we just learned the forest dance. I forget what that one's called. There's grinding, there's this kind of thing, where in order to get something, you have to walk across half the universe. There's getting lost in dungeons. There's a lot of repetitive, tedious, honestly, not that fun stuff that you have to get through when you're playing an RPG. And yet you continue playing them. And the question then becomes, A, why do they do it that way? And B, why do we keep playing a game even after it stops being fun? And there's a few different answers. Phil Sandifer argues in his discussion of Final Fantasy IV that it's basically a way of padding out the value of the game. Of being able to say, oh yes, this game has 100 hours of gameplay, this game has 40 hours of gameplay. That makes it more worth the price tag, would be the thinking. Given that consoles traditionally have been priced in, especially back when they were treated more as children's toys, they were priced largely within the price range of the working poor. They were $100, $120, which for the time was the amount of money that you might get in a surprise windfall, or that you might be willing to spend on, like, the only Christmas gift that your child is getting. Or that even a child could save up in a year or two out of allowance or milk money or whatever. And in return, you got hours upon hours upon hours of the kids shutting up and sitting down, which, as I mentioned in a previous episode, when you've got, when you're working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and on top of that you have to, budget and coupon clip and save money and cook food, being able to get your kid to sit down and shut up reliably for hours on end is worth $100, $120 if you got it. So, that's one argument, that basically this is what gets the kids sitting down and shutting up, because it's taking advantage of an element of human psychology. It's taking advantage of how we deal with rewards and reward structures. Basically, there's a lot of different ways to provide rewards for behavior. I just did Terra's transformation, and of course this early in the game, she doesn't get a chance to actually do anything by the time her transformation wears off, but it still builds up her skill at it. As I was saying, there's multiple different ways of structuring rewards, and it turns out that the most effective, the one that gets people to do the behavior the most, is where both the timing of the reward... Oh, okay, so you can't redo the waterfall. So it really is just the river or the serpent trench reward. Anyway, as I was saying, the timing of the reward is random, and the size of the reward is random. So you cannot predict when you're going to get a reward or how good the reward is going to be. That actually turns out to be the strongest motivator for human behavior. That's why slot machines are addictive. That's why we play tedious, boring Facebook games that sometimes give us a little bing. We turn out to be very strongly motivated by that kind of thing. Which makes sense because it's the reward pattern for a hunter-gatherer. You don't know when you're going to find fruit or how much fruit you're going to find. You don't know whether your hunt will catch an animal or how large an animal it's going to be. So we find that very motivating, because that was how our ancestors ate. You know, proto-humans who didn't find that pattern of reward motivating would not gather as much food or hunt as much and not survive. So because that's very effective on us, that makes, random encounters a little more interesting than you might otherwise expect. Even though they are very repetitive, you don't know when one's going to happen. You don't know how much experience and gold you're going to get from it. You don't know if you're going to get a treasure. You don't know if you're going to learn a new ability. These happen at unpredictably uneven intervals. You gain levels unpredictably and unevenly. You reach your destination as you walk through the world map or the dungeon full of random encounters. You don't know when that's going to happen. Or if you're playing the game for the first time, what's going to happen when you get there. So that adds up to make random encounters a motivator. It makes, even though they're individually not particularly rewarding, they become kind of addictive, which I think is why some people have no problem with grinding as a game mechanic. Personally, I'm not a fan of it, but some people are totally fine with it. Some people will grind for hours. And even though I say I'm not really a fan of it, there are some games in which I find myself enjoying grinding. Back when I played Pokemon, which I stopped a couple of years ago because I played it for like 17 years and that was enough for me, I used to enjoy grinding. Fire Emblem, the 3DS Fire Emblem that actually allows grinding, I find myself enjoying grinding. In some... And so I completely understand how other people would find it enjoyable in a one more turn, one more encounter, the next one might get me something kind of a way. So there's that. There's also, and Sandiford hints at this when he's talking about it, and years ago a friend of mine presented it as his theory of why JRPGs contains so much tedium, as it's preparation for adult life. Because if you're the child of the working poor, odds are you're going to grow up to be the working poor. And that means, odds are, you're going to have a tedious, repetitive job on a factory line, or loading things, or as a receptionist, or, the kinds of jobs that are available to the working poor. Even if you're in the professional class, odds are your job is going to mostly consist of tedious bullshit. I know mine does. So, this is preparation for that. Our jobs are a form of grinding. Unfortunately, our jobs generally have the wrong reward pattern. Unless you're a freelancer, your job probably has relatively predictable rewards at predictable intervals. Or if you're salaried. If you work hourly, then you have unpredictably sized rewards because it's based on how many hours you work that pay period, but it's still at predictable intervals. It's per pay period. And while those are motivating, they're not as good motivators. So that's why we'd all rather grind in an RPG than do our jobs. But regardless of that, and there's why I bothered to get Water Rondo, because it has some really powerful moves. It's got a good healing move, it's got that powerful lightning attack that we just did, Plasma I think it's called. Water Rondo is pretty great, and Mog is pretty great. I'll just tell you now, I intend to use Mog as much as possible for the rest of the game because I love it. Even after dances stop being that useful as we get into the game, by that time we'll have the ability to turn him into effectively a drag union from Final Fantasy 4 and 5, and he continues to be awesome. However, it does not change that this little world tour of ours is kind of obnoxious. lot of random encounters, a lot of tedium, and it's all areas we've already been in a big loop in an attempt to get back to where we started so that we can continue the plot. So, I will spare you some of that tedium and get us to the next spot. So, just as before, we wake up in Nikea. And then we can take a ship to South Figaro from there, just as in Saban's plotline. I will admit, I always found the little ship graphics in the Super Nintendo Final Fantasy games, particularly this and FF4. FF5 lets you actually control the ships, so it's a little different, but I find this little animation very cute. But enough of that. We progress on to South Figaro, an area we've been to before. Interestingly, once we arrive, the game actually does something kind of nifty, which is recognize that at this point in the story, South Figaro is occupied by the Empire, so we can't be seen walking around. So the captain of the ship smuggles us through in a treasure chest. It's kind of adorable. I'm sorry we didn't get to see this at the end of Saban's plotline, but it's a cute little Easter egg to have now. Of course, now we have to go through South. No. We do not have to go through South Figaro, luckily, but we are going to have to go down the river, I believe. I honestly can't remember which way to go next. But we'll check back in when I figure it out. So yes, since our goal is to get back to the old man's house north of the belt, we are actually going to have to take the river to get there, which means going through all of Mount Colts again. Entire dungeons, huge chunks of the world map. This really is a ridiculous amount of stuff to have to do, but Water Rondo is really good, and this is the only way to get it. Okay, now we've made it through all of that. In the process, we picked up some new spells. We've learned a bunch of abilities for Mog. I think the only dances we don't have at this point are Snowman Jazz and the one you get for fighting in towns, which there's no opportunity to do so at this point of it. But now, you go to Returner's Hideout to go through the river. And Returner's Hideout is almost completely abandoned, which makes sense. The center of the rebellion is largely moved to Narsh. Now I could have started here. I could have landed the airship outside of here and gone on the river and learned Water Rondo that way. But it doesn't really matter because I would have had to do the loop either way. It's the same loop, all that changes is what the starting point of the loop is. I chose to use North of the Belt, but I would have had to go around all the same locations to get back here. So, now we go in the river. Yay. And now finally, we reach the end of the river, and we're back at the airship in the old man's house. So, after all that, I'm gonna take a quick nap. And I think we're done for this time. Next time, we continue on with the actual story. And now have Mog. So, great. See you all then. Bye.